push it on.
And over to you.
Okay, right. Bear with me just a second. Okay, what I'm talking about is the sort of the ability of any researcher to understand the sort of the range of tools and techniques that are available to them. But of course, what I'm always conscious of is, and hence the title, that when you set out to do research, perhaps the most important question is, what is it you want to find out? Sometimes this is really clear, and in that sense, then that determines what it is you're going to do, and more particularly, the nature of the phenomenon. The way I always liken this or analogize it is that if you're going to cut a piece of wood in half, and you'd never done it before and never seen any tools, and somebody presented you with an axe and a saw, by trial and error, you could cut the sort of piece of wood with the sort of the axe, but it wouldn't be, it'd be a pretty rough job, and it wouldn't be equal. With a sort of saw, and knowing roughly where you want to cut it, you can get a sort of much better cut. And essentially what I'm saying is that learning to use the right tools. But of course, I think one of the big issues of research is that you can disappear down what I call rabbit holes. This comes from the sort of the Alice Through the Looking Glass, the Lewis Carroll novel, which some of you may have read. And it's the whole idea that disappearing down rabbit holes, well, it can be intensely frustrating. And as I also mentioned, dead ends, trying to research things and then finding out it's not as possible or not as easy. And indeed, maybe, to use another word, it may be impossible to do what you thought you were going to do. But I'm going to turn this on its head and also say that if you sort of are aware of possibilities, and this is where the sort of word serendipity, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a few moments with the use of a slide. If you're aware of alternative possibilities, it may be that it's very possible then to sort of to embark on a different journey. And because I do like the idea of sort of journeys. I mean, the thing is, as we know, journeys are often about going from a specific point to another specific point or predetermined point, and trying to do it in the fastest route possible. And that's very sensible. But I think quite often the nature of research, particularly at doctoral level, is that you start off from one point, very obviously, but the sort of the end point is often not so certain. And I think part of the sort of the issue is maybe conscious or being conscious of falling down the rabbit hole, but allowing yourself to be exposed to sort of the possibilities that may open up, and perhaps being willing to be flexible and adapt the sort of the research proposal and the objectives and the perhaps hypothesis and the questions to sort of suit the prevailing circumstances. But just before I do start, the one thing I'm always conscious of is that research, I mean, we do it every day of our lives. You know, we think about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. We do it subconsciously. This obviously, and the nature of research at doctoral level is very much different, that there's a lot of work and pre-thought that's got to go into it. Okay, I'm going to go to the, sort of the first slide. So you've probably seen the learning outcomes, but recognizing what these rabbit holes are and trying, if possible, to avoid too many dead ends, because of course, one of the things that happens, certainly in my research, is people become disillusioned if they sort of hit dead ends, or it's very time consuming, particularly if you read an awful lot of literature. Those of you that have been in the call for the last number of minutes, we were talking about this. I'm of the view that you can, once you decide what you're going to do, for sure, you need to read the literature, but it can become in itself a very time consuming activity, and it can become a dead end in itself because it's kind of never ending. As I always say, if you read a research report, at the end of it, it's probably got umpteen references, sometimes into 3 figures. And if you try and read every one of those, and then you try and read all the references at the end of those pieces of text or those articles, as I say, it's a kind of vortex, and you get sucked into it. So you've got to be very careful about reading enough to get you going. I'm a great believer in trying to sort of get out and be in the empirical world, or at least to start collecting data, because I think data is it's where you've got to make sense, and any piece of research is, in my opinion, not credible unless it has some sort of data. So recognizing what these are and trying to avoid the dead ends is important. Okay, and specifically, what we're going to do is to sort of think about competence. And competence comes, I think, with confidence, knowing what you're up to, looking at the sort of range of tools. I'm a great believer that the mismatch between theory and practice, and what I mean by this is that sort of theory is this word that people sort of tend to put a lot of faith in, but theories are just explanations. People have theories about people living on different planets. It may or not be true, but until we sort of discover life in the known universe, there is no evidence. But explanations or theories, to use the sort of word, are all very well. But of course, the reality is that practice, particularly in terms of people who work in organizations, which of course is where I'm particularly interested in management business type research, is that what do they do and how they do it? They find ways of coping, and they can understand it from their own perspective. But of course, can we make sense of what they're up to? And that's part of the sort of the gift that we have as dialogical creatures. We can go and ask them for their own explanation and make sense thereof. I also, and hopefully what's come out of what I've been saying, is the sort of the power of reflection. We are reflective creatures. We think about what we do. Those that do not become pathological creatures, or that we hear about sort of people who are on a range of sort of, or a spectrum, if you will. But most of us, we think about what we do what we do, we think about it again, and we then perhaps adapt our practice. It's the sort of the nature of our lives, and hopefully as we get older, we learn more about what we do and become better, although not necessarily. But I also sort of, I like this word agility. I think it's overused and misused, but agility is just adapting. Again, for as long as humanity has been on this planet, we've had to adapt to the sort of changing circumstances. We've been told about this in terms of global warming, but whether that makes life more difficult, well, it probably will do. We will adapt to suit, and we'll probably find, as we're sort of capable, scientific solutions to sort of deal with our circumstances. But on a more prosaic level or mundane level, as human beings, we adapt every day of our lives to what goes on around us. Both from the sort of its physical manifestation or the environmental concerns, and more particularly the people that we work with and interact with. I'm also a great believer that what we should do, as particularly in the sort of the world of management research, is provide faithful accounts. I read too many, or have read too much, which suggests what might be, or what could be, or how it possibly could be under different circumstances. I think it's much easier, or sorry, not much easier, much better rather, to understand the world as is, and then to sort of start from that point, as opposed to sort of how it might be, and then to try and cajole people to sort of to move to it without sort of understanding what the impediments may be. So that's why I believe faithful accounts of actual practice, with all the sort of the attendant problems and the sort of the idiosyncrasies that sort of people bring with them. Just to sort of add that I think that's what makes human beings interesting, that we are inherently irrational at times. We are not robots programmed to do things. That's what makes organizations interesting, but often frustrating places for those who wish to have consistent practice. That's not the way that we're hardwired as human beings. And of course, finally, the confidence, I mentioned that at the beginning, confidence at the beginning, but what should come out of all this is confidence to challenge the existing, the orthodoxy, the conventional wisdom, and indeed, dare I say it, so much of what is presented in research, particularly in the management arena, is of idealized accounts that I sometimes don't recognize as being in existence in the sort of the practice that I've seen. Okay, what does it feel like to be a doctoral researcher? Well, the one thing that I think that should come out of what I've been saying is that it's rarely a linear process. I know that if you had a number of students who've been through the sort of the classical, as I call it, lab-based research, they would probably tell you something different. because I've been on doctoral courses where you've got dozens and dozens, and often a couple of hundred students who they sit doing something which is very largely predetermined. The phenomena is what exists within that laboratory, and the decisions, or the decisions about what to do, how to do it, have been taken by others. So it can become a sort of fairly, dare I say, straightforward route, difficult as it may be in terms of the sort of the formula that might have to be sort of coped with, particularly if you're doing something very scientific. But I would sort of say, when it comes to sort of organizational research, it doesn't tend to operate in the same way. And this is why I like to add the sort of the health warning. Hypotheses, hypothetical deductive research is all very well if you know what the terrain is, what is you want to achieve, the nature of the phenomena. But when it comes to sort of to dealing with organizations which are sort of populated by human beings, and that will continue for as long as I'm around, because I don't see that changing anyway soon, despite the sort of the advent and the sort of the strides being made by autonomous intelligence and all that comes with that. Then we will be, we deal with human beings. So what comes out of that then is that inherent uncertainty, and learning to recognize that is absolutely essential, because of course uncertainty is the sort of the nature of our world. And the person who believes that they know what the future will be is plain wrong, and sometimes very dangerous. Over certainty, it leads you to do things that sort of perhaps will not allow you to sort of to cope with uncertainty. So as I say, we learn to adapt, and of course that's the sort of the next bullet point: coping mechanisms, recognizing sort of what may go wrong, and that it's not the end of the line, that there are sort of reasons why these things happen, and we can sort of, as I say, cope with the sort of the difficulties, and have sort of different strategies or tactics for so doing. I've touched upon this already. Don't expect the literature to provide a definitive route map to success. I think the sort of literature, by the nature of what it is, and dare I say it, most even refereed articles are about 5,000 words. Textbooks tend to be better, but of course textbooks that it's a different type of audience, but they tend to provide a view which is, as I've said, oversimplified, and it doesn't tell you about the individual experience. Quite often that's for you to work out, and that's the real skill of the sort of the doctoral journey, learning to sort of to cope with the sort of the inherent uncertainties, and being able to sort of to recognize the sort of the range of tools that you've got at your disposal, and selecting the tools that work best in the sort of prevailing circumstances. It's part of that difficulty. The next bullet point, which flows on from that, is the sort of the formulating probing questions. As I say, if you go in with predetermined questions, I mean, in fact, let me just start myself there and say, if you ask a question, that there is a view that it presupposes you know what the answer is like to be, and that's why I like the idea of probing questions. It's neatly summarized with the sort of expression learning to learn, if you will, or learning to know what's possible, and by so doing, you get to sort of to appreciate the possibilities, and then can adapt, and you can sort of focus the question on the basis of the sort of things that you're able to achieve, most particularly in terms of access to the data. Because again, one of the things that is very important to understand is that people often make this mistake of thinking organizations are entirely open. They may be, but they may not also be. That organizations are sometimes secretive, and there are things that you think that you want to know, and they're not going to tell you, and that's perfectly within their right. Because there are confidentiality issues and all sorts of other sort of perhaps to do with sort of their business expertise, but nonetheless, if your research is based upon getting those answers which they cannot or will not give to you, then you have a problem. There's a host of things that will come out. I'll deal with this in a sort of a subsequent slide about the sort of the morality and the ethics of going as an undercover investigative researcher. But I think any university these days that has got any sense will not allow that to happen, because of course it leaves you wide open to a whole plethora of claims from organizations, particularly if you sort of undermine commercial information and the like. I've mentioned this already. We had a very big discussion before the sort of presentation. Data collection is the priority. I often think that if I can give you sort of some advice that came from my supervisor way back. I did my PhD in the 1990s or the early 90s, and he said that you've got to remember that there are two piles. One pile is your literature pile, and the other pile is your data pile. And his advice was try and keep them in rough equivalents. And of course, what tends to happen is that sort of people try and read more, and then they read something different, and that gives a different perspective. And in trying to sort of to have what I call complete knowledge, the literature pile grows and grows and grows, and it becomes like a mountain. And in the meantime, nothing's happening on the data because it's data that will sort of drive your research. So the earlier you can get into sort of doing the data, the better. And it will also help for you to clarify the sort of the limits of the sort of the literature that you're reading and where its frailties are. And dare I say it, that is actually sort of an opportunity. There's one of, you might see that as being a bit of a dead end or sort of a problem or one of the rabbit holes. But of course, by so doing, if you're able to expose the limits of literature, and by carrying out the research that you conduct or you intend to conduct, you're able to provide different perspectives, then you are contributing to knowledge. And of course, that's the sort of the clincher. Of course, the end game as far as sort of doctoral research, of course, is concerned. And indeed, any research is a peer-reviewed publication. So for sort of university research, that's being published in a sort of journal. But in your own research, it's providing and presenting and defending, as we sort of say in the, sort of the United Kingdom, certainly a thesis which contains the sort of the background literature, but also data that you have collected with respect to sort of the phenomena that you're interested in, and been able to sort of to dare I stress this, the sort of the novel knowledge or something new, contributing something that didn't exist already. Because if it already existed, then it's not new knowledge, and that is, as I say, what external and internal, all examiners are looking for when they examine your thesis. I know this last point may seem a little bit of a catch-all, but of course I put it to sort of people who do research. Theoretical models, they're, by the nature of what they are, they're oversimplified. I mean, again, in management research, which I do a lot of, I like mind maps and fuzzy logic and the rich pictures. But of course, and even then, it's a kind of, it has to be an oversimplification, because of course, real life is really complex, and it alters sometimes very, very rapidly. So whatever you present may be as good as you can get it when you present your research, but you have to recognize that it won't last as long as you want. And of course, the thing also, as I mentioned, in terms of books tend to be published much more quickly than they used to, but the nature of sort of research is that by the time it gets to the press, the influences may have moved or adapted and changed, and of course it's no longer as valid as it once did. Doesn't mean to say that the research was not good when it was published. It's just the nature of what happens in day-to-day practice. Okay, preliminary thoughts. I've mentioned here the sort of the couple of quotations. Through the looking glass, the Red Queen tells Alice that the world keeps shifting so quickly on her feet that she has to keep running just to keep her position. And I think that's a nice sort of summary of where research often feels that they are, particularly if they're examining something which, of course, is very contemporary. That the world seems to be changing more quickly than you can cope with it. And yeah, that's the nature of what goes on, and it provides lots of dilemmas. But you've got to sort of to be able to sort of to cope with it, and also remember. And again, what I would also stress is that if you're examining practitioners who are coping with these changing conditions, they've got to cope with it. And of course, your job then is to sort of to research their ability to so do. Again. When Alice fell down, I took this quote from somewhere else. When Alice fell down the rabbit hole, it was back simple. When she stepped to the looking glass, it was her own free will and a braver deed by far. And that's the point. Recognizing that you may fall down these holes, it may feel very uncertain, and you're not sure what to do. Don't give up. Recognize that there is a future, that there are prospects, and what you've got to be able to do is to sort of explore the opportunities and to adapt yourself to sort of the opportunities that best suit the circumstances. And again, okay, final bullet point. A researcher must learn to work on instinct and adapt to what's possible, not what's ideal, because of course the ideal often is impossible to achieve, and that's what will sort of cause you to become, I use the word advisedly, but disabled by the sort of the impossibilities and the sort of magnitude of what you do. The other thing I would add is that, again, it's always a question of sort of trying to be modest in your sort of objectives. So too many students I've come across want to sort of do research that changes the world and then find that it's not going to work like that. That is something that will sort of cause you big problems. Serendipity, it's a noun. It comes from the 18th century author Horace Walpole. You may have heard of him. And he took it from the Persian fairy tale, The Three Princes Serendip. And of course, the whole idea of serendipity, you see the adverb there, serendipitously, it's finding something that you weren't looking for. So it's the sort of the whole thing about chance. And I think that is a sort of a really good way of carrying out research to sort of again, unless you're absolutely sort of confined by what you must do, because of course it's been predetermined in the way that I described a little bit earlier on. When you go into organizations, lots of things are going on, and it is this whole sort of aspect of life as an everyday phenomenon. There are always lots of really interesting things to sort of research that people don't, it's the taken for granted assumptions, as we call it in cultural terms, that the things that people do but don't think about are the things that, as an outsider, are interesting. I'm also very acutely aware that doctoral practitioners often research their own organizations, and there it becomes the sort of the real dilemma, learning to sort of to look within and without. And by that I mean is that the things that you do and perhaps you take for granted, you've then got to sort of to look outside yourself. It's like the out of body experience, whereby you start to examine the research that the things that you do as almost outsider, and of course there are lots of dilemmas in that, but of course it makes a very fruitful piece of work, particularly if you are able to present fascinating and intriguing insights. Okay, competent researcher, especially one engaged in a doctorate, will embrace chance and opportunities to better understand, and hopefully that comes out loud and clear. The importance of asking questions. Well, again, in everything I've been saying up until now, you may have heard this expression, the chickens and eggs, which comes first. Well, who knows? Doing the research is important. Getting access is also very important. Getting data, and as I keep stressing, unless the sort of the research is absolutely predetermined and locked in, you have a lot of scope and choice to sort of to adapt those questions in a way that sort of you think will suit best to what you think you want to find out. But of course, I'm speaking in very general terms, and of course I'm also acutely aware that becomes one of your sort of rabbit holes, that you can ask so many questions that you don't know what it is that you're sort of asking anymore. So at some point it does become essential to sort of to pin it down. And indeed, as I said there, the challenge is perhaps not the lack of questions, but the need to understand what's possible, and also to sort of to have a range of questions. So it's a range of possibilities. And then at some point, and of course, you've got to give yourself an adequate amount of time to do this, but you don't allow yourself to sort of do it for too long, because of course then you become, as Tom Peters and Robert Wharton in their famous book, Analysis by Paralysis, you just don't do anything, because of course you don't know what it is you want to do anymore. Okay, avoiding the tendency to see what you believe rather than what is from the perspective of others. That's absolutely sort of crucial also. If you're going to talk to people, and again, would add the sort of the caveat here that if the nature of the phenomena, if you're in a laboratory, you don't talk to the phenomena, or the sort of what it is that's under study. It's being measured, and you get objective measurements. I accept that. But certainly in sort of the world in which I operate, in management research, you're talking to people and they can give their own subjective opinions about what they think is going on, which may be very different. Their rationalization of what they think they're up to, or what they think that they're doing, may be very different to what you think that they are, simply by observing. And of course, this is the sort of the beauty of sort of working with other human beings. They can give their own explanations. Okay, but being a researcher, even in practice, requires deep consideration as the problems as they exist. And of course, the world is full of problems, but we normally find solutions to them. And of course, that's part of what the sort of the research is about. And as I constantly, I think, emphasized, the willingness to explore and be flexible and to adapt questions as you progress. And I'm conscious that I don't want to overdo that one. Okay. What creates interesting, impactful research? I've mixed the words up. The problem's interesting, and again, I think that's the thing you say. But of course, I appreciate this word "interesting" is also highly subjective. As I mentioned a couple of moments ago, things that go on in organisations on a day-to-day basis may seem mundane, yeah, and people say, "Well, it's just what we do." But you, as either an outsider, which of course is what I normally am as a university researcher, may be very well. I will see it differently to those people because, of course, that's the sort of the nature of my endeavour. And also, if you are sort of researching practice within your own organisation, you may see it differently. So, yeah, learn to spot those aspects. Of course, the sort of the most interesting and fascinating research, in my opinion, is where the sort of researchers manage to sort of to highlight and to give insights into sort of what is going on and why, and the sort of the idiosyncrasies and all that sort of goes on in an organisation when people come together. This should be pretty obvious, but again, you know, I do sort of state it because it's important. The problem is original and not merely showing the obvious, because you know, that's what sort of drives research. It's a sort of a contribution to knowledge, and it's the sort of the benchmark that all researchers have to sort of to achieve, most especially when you're working at doctoral level, because that's what the examiners will be looking for, the originality in what you've managed to sort of to present. And the research provides insights into the research problem that will be useful and, dare I say, demonstrate value to, as I said initially, the reviewer, which of course are the examiners, probably the host organizations, and beyond. Of course, that's the other thing. You know, dissemination is important. It's what all researchers live or die by. Yeah, publication of their work. Developing ideas, it's an important aspect of this. If you have lots of ideas, some will be good, some will not be so good. And part of the sort of the skill that you will have to develop is the sort of yeah, lots of people, and we've all done it, they have one brilliant idea and they wonder why it doesn't work. And of course, often the sort of the greatest innovations are they come out of the sort of the serendipity thing, the serendipity notion. It didn't work, but something came out of it as a kind of byproduct that they had never contemplated at the outset, and it worked differently. And that's where the sort of, as I say, the great inventions and the great innovators, you know, they learn to adapt and don't sort of rip it up. And of course, you know, the great entrepreneurs, as I also appreciate, they try something, it fails. They try something else, it fails. They may try umpteen things, it fails. But they keep trying, and eventually, because of their perseverance, something clicks, of course, and that's what makes them extremely successful and perhaps extremely wealthy. But that's a different objective. I would say it's harder to teach courage and imagination, which is part of the skill set, and it comes with perseverance. Don't give up. And keep trying and adapting, because of course there will be something that you can do. And of course, in saying that, it may shift the emphasis in terms of sort of the literature that you looked at the outset, and it may require you to sort of to go back and to have to sort of to start looking at the literature again, or maybe look at different literature. And that's part of the sort of the challenge. And it may feel like it's anything you've done up to that point is, if not wasted, but it may not be used. But I would safely say, in terms of my own sort of PhD thesis, you know, I wrote or presented 80,000 words, but I would safely say I probably wrote, I don't know, 3 times that amount, so 250,000 words. So you know, 2/3 it was never used, but that is the sort of the nature of it. And of course, the amount of excess thinking I had to do, but that's part of the sort of the endeavor. Filtering, again, you know, this is where your advisor, your supervisors, the people that you're involved with, and of course your peers, you know, people, if you're working with other PhD students and other researchers, they will have really good advice on the basis of their experience that can help you. you will get better with time and spend less time evaluating, discarding bad ideas. And of course that's that's part of the confidence, and confidence comes with sort of having doing things. And the more you do it, the better you become at it. It's the more I practice, the better I get. There's no, as I say, there's no predetermined model that's going to sort of give you all the answers. Have faith in your own judgment, and remember your advisor is not infallible. They have their perspective. You may have yours, because of course when it comes down to it, certainly as a sort of doctoral researcher, it's you that's being examined in the sort of the viva, and it's your thesis, not theirs. So don't if you get to a viva, come out with a line or the defense, oh, I didn't believe in it, I only put it in there because my supervisor told me. It won't help you. You've got to be able to defend your own thoughts, and often having the courage of your convictions is part of what the sort of the skill and confidence is about. And again, this to come back to sort of the ideas, or at least the sort of what we're talking about here. Generate lots of ideas before filtering, breadth first, not depth, and then clarify, to sort of and to hone it, to sort of to refine it. That's part of the skill, as you sort of learn to sort of to adapt to sort of the data that you're able to get hold of. Okay, in terms of what is it you're trying to do? Can you articulate it? And of course, this is also the difficulty that, and of course, it'll be something that you expect to do. You'll have a question or hypothesis, and you'll then have to sort of to filter that down into sort of objectives. And if you can't adequately and accurately define the objectives at the outset, it probably means it's not going to work. And of course, the best objectives are those which are quite simple. And I'm a great believer that I would stress, start really, really simple, because life, or research and life, the two go hand in hand. It gets more complex as time goes by, not the other way around. And of course, that's why I get many students, they have very grandiose and elaborate and really complicated sort of pieces of objectives. And then it becomes impossible to operationalize or to actually sort of do anything. I think start from sort of a low level and work upwards, and not try and do it the other way around, because that's a guaranteed way of falling into a very deep rabbit hole, out of which there's probably sort of no escape. Knowing the limits of the current practice, that's also very important, because of course, if you can add to sort of that knowledge, that's really valuable. Demonstrating what's novel in your approach and how you've done it, the sort of the data, that'd be really important. Can it be published? I mean, again, the test of good research, of course, is that you can actually sort of publish it elsewhere, because of course it does contribute to knowledge, and that's how the world operates. And dare I say, in the COVID world that we've been living in for the last 18 months or so, research, of course, has been absolutely essential. And indeed, one of the things that's sort of had to happen is the sort of fast tracking of research, and not going quite through the sort of same timeframes as normal, which is measured in years, to try and get research that terms of sort of vaccines to market, and going through that sort of process. But and that's the nature of it, getting into the peer review journals, because of course that's what will actually sort of change the sort of our understanding, and will help us in the future. What difference it make? And in all research, there will be risks. You've got to think about those, and indeed that may be part of the ethical considerations that you have to go through. There are going to be costs in terms of the time traveling, and of course, the one thing that you're going to have to do and recognize is that if you need to talk to people, if you want to carry out interviews, which I'm a great believer of doing in terms of business and management research, don't just assume that people will give you time. They may do, but it may be very limited. And of course, it may be that it'll suit their time frames and not yours. So recognize all of that. And of course, the other thing about research is it's not done instantaneously, quite clearly, measured in certainly many, many months. And in the terms of doctoral research, it's normally measured as a full-time student in terms of 3 years from sort of beginning to finish, and 5 to 6 years as a sort of part-time researcher. And of course, they can vary upwards and downwards. And I'll say no more, because it's almost like we've kind of come back to where we start. So I appreciate the fact that literature, and I think we've said an awful lot about this. remembering if it provides an idealized view, that's useful. And lots of people try to develop conceptual models. They summarize what's gone on already. Be aware of the sort of the fact that the idealized views work in the way that they work. But that's all it is. It's oversimplified, and preconceived models, they have validity, but part of the skill is being able to sort of to recognize the limits of that validity, and also to sort of to be able to critique. And of course, I appreciate people won't be able to do that immediately, but nonetheless, they will be able to do it as time goes on. If those models have limitations and frailties, and dare I say it, my experience is that they normally do, because of course that's the way that sort of people develop these things, that they tend to oversimplify them into sort of the diagrams we find in standard textbooks, because that's the sort of that's the game that's played, because of course it makes for a sort of a nice summary. Can it ever sort of be put into practice? Well, that's a different objective. As a way of illustration, anybody who's ever looked at sort of any motivational models will know that you look at the sort of the hierarchy of needs from sort of Maslow. If you've never seen it, do have a look at it afterwards. It contains a lot of common sense, but at the same sort of time, does it tell you how to people really motivate themselves? It's a glorious oversummary, but it doesn't sort of tell you the whole story from everyone. And of course, also remember, people have their own perspectives, their own preferences, and their own views about what they think works and does not work. So a lot of what is imbued comes from sort of their personalities. And of course, what you're always after is what will you contribute in terms of new knowledge. Again, I took this from a sort of a textbook. Again, I'm not going to sort of go through all of this, but it's always just a question of sort of thinking about where does your research question fit into sort of the bigger scheme of things. And of course, it's kind of beginning, but sometimes an end. I'm going to let you into a little secret. Sometimes research questions are adapted right at the end to fit the research that's been carried out. So it's a kind of starting point, but it's also an end point, insofar as that the other piece of advice I'd also give to anybody that's writing their doctoral thesis is that quite often the first chapter people write is the introduction, and it's a very good place to start, because this is what I think I'm going to do. And of course, what happens is that when they get to the end, they find that they've done something different, or it's shifted in particular ways. So what you've got to then do is go back and rewrite the introduction, or indeed maybe rewrite significant parts to sort of suit what it is that you actually achieved. Silverman calls this reconstructed logic. It goes on all the time, but research questions and hypotheses, they're part of what goes on. And questions, principles, interacting propositions, these are all propositions rather, and speculative propositions, and they're just examples. I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to over elaborate, because I want to go through some of the techniques. But propositions are good because, of course, they're tentative positions, if you will, and therefore, and that there's some sort of examples on the sort of right hand side. But propositions, they can be altered depending upon, as I keep stressing, the sort of the nature of the data that, which of course comes from the phenomena that you're observing or researching or experimenting upon, if that's what you're doing. It allows you sort of that ability to adapt, what's known in the trade as a bit of wriggle room. Don't lock yourself into something that becomes impossible. Data. It should be empirical, and all empirical means is that it's what's done. Our whole lives are empirical. It's about sort of trying and learning from mistakes, but it's based upon practice, what works and doesn't work, as it were, which we're very good at sort of learning from. Learning to see things differently, and again, I think that's part of the skill of a researcher, the ability to sort of to reconsider and things that you thought were taken for granted, maybe looking at it from a different sort of lens, as it were. Difficult, I accept, and also it requires time. And I think the best practitioners, certainly in terms of management research, are those who allow themselves time and space to reflect. Because too many people do things and they do it because it's always been done that way, and they never question it. I've mentioned this already, issues of confidentiality, that you can't always assume that people will tell you the things that you think you want to know to operationalize your research, because that's the sort of the nature of daily life. But of course, these are all aspects and considerations that you will have to sort of consider in the sort of next bullet point: the ethics and morals of what you do. You know, for sure, I've come across research which has been carried out covertly. But boy, oh boy, yeah, it's pretty old. I think most universities are really sort of worried about sort of problems of morality and ethics. But at the same sort of time, if you haven't considered these things properly, this could become one of the sort of the rabbit holes that you disappear down and from which you never emerge. It's also another issue of recording. If you're going to record interviews, perhaps with practitioners, and I've done this myself, you have to get their permission. You can't sort of secretly record, because of course that's an invasion of privacy, not to mention a whole lot of other things that sort of become problematic. So make sure that sort of you've sorted that one out prior to sort of going into conduct research. This is an interesting one: avoiding bias, because of course we all have bias, we all have our views, and I think that you try and avoid it as much as possible. But I think that there comes a point at which you've got to recognise that you can't just exclude it, or you can't pretend it doesn't happen. And maybe the fact that you're carrying out a piece of research into something in particular, that shows your sort of your own particular preferences and biases. So work with it and not against it, and merely recognise it. Well, it's something I think in your methodology chapter. Then if you sort of raise this issue, then it gives you plenty of scope for the examiners to discuss. But I also think that by having thought about it, you've covered yourself up clearly. Of course, if you're in a laboratory, it's not about bias, because of course the nature of the phenomena, it doesn't talk back to you. I'm going to go through the sort of methods quickly, but and actually this is related to sort of my own research. So I appreciate I'm not talking about experimental research, because of course that's not my particular game, although I started off as an engineer, so I'm fully aware of that. But there's a whole set of protocols that sort of exist around that. But qualitative research, of course, is the sort of the interpretive techniques. It really, as you see from the definition there, seek to describe, decode, translate, and otherwise come to terms of meaning, not the frequency of certain more or less naturally occurring phenomena in the social world. And essentially what I'm saying in that is that if you've got people working in sort of organizational settings, they will tell you the things that sort of they do, and they'll give you their own perceptions. Is it the truth? Well, that's an interesting sort of question, to which I'm not going to try and give you an answer. They'll tell you what they think that they want to tell you, and maybe sometimes what they've been instructed to tell you. Will it be consistent? You hope so, but of course there's no guarantee. And of course this is one of the things I'm always acutely aware of. I've seen lots of research where people are sort of given questionnaires, and then the questionnaire is done very shortly afterwards, and of course there's a different range of responses. And is that a problem? Well, yes and no, but people that they have their views, and what they tell you is, when they tell you is what they tell you. That it's it's a bit like police interviews. You're not you expect to try and get the truth, but people don't always say the things that they should say or tell the truth, because of course there may be a whole host of sort of consequences from so doing. To follow on from that, emphasis is what goes on, and using understanding from the perspective of, in inverted commas, the actors. This is a sociological term. The people who do things, they do what they do, they interpret their situations in the best way that they do, and they make sense according to their own sort of backgrounds and the sort of their own psychological makeup and their own experience. They bring whatever they bring, and that helps them to sort of become successful in whichever way that they are, or not, as the case may be. What I would also say is that sort of deductive research, of course, is where I start up with a hypothesis. There's life on other planets. That's a deduction, but I've got to prove it. Whereas inductive is more about the sort of the surface of knowledge, and sort of the bring out of knowledge that hitherto, it's not that it didn't exist, but of course it's the sort of learning from the sort of the practice and the worlds around us, and most particularly, as the second part of the second sentence, trying to avoid the preconceived beliefs or reasons for actions. And this is the sort of the issue of bias. you may think you know what people are up to, let them sort of tell you, and then try and make sense of that. And the focus on collecting data that's largely not numerical, although, as I fully accept, numbers may play a part at some subsequent sort of aspect. I'm a great believer, ask the questions first and then develop the questionnaires if you sort of feel that the need to sort of do that, not the other way around. Okay, so, well, again, the quantitative data, what's the difference? The emphasis is less pronounced. Do what interests you. Context is important. I'm conscious of time also. Helps explain what's going on. Considering processual issues to see what change and variation as explanation, not simply causal. Again, it's not an experiment, allowing people to sort of describe their worlds as they see them. Much less structured, and again, avoiding closed questions. If I ask you, what time did you get up? That's a closed question. What time did you feel like getting up at? Or what did you have for breakfast? Were you hungry? Yeah, again, I'm very crudely trying to sort of to expose the sort of the fact that when we engage in conversations, we have a range of sort of a repertoire, if you will, of asking questions to sort of to surface the knowledge that we think is important, to sort of to form those relationships and to garner the knowledge that we see as being important to carry out whatever or decision making, or merely just to sort of engage in relationships. All things considered, again, if certainly in organizational research, there are lots of things that people use, the documents, procedures, and so on and so forth. And we were talking about quality management before this started. Quality is based upon procedure manuals. My experience often is that people do work despite and not because of, but again, it depends. Quite clearly, a lot of it has got to do with experience. Awareness that sort of social reality is constructed by those who live through the experience. It's not imposed. If we believe we know the answers, we may be sort of rudely awoken by the sort of the responses that we get. And most importantly, this research requires the researcher to become actively involved. So it's a matter of going in and, dare I say, sort of you immerse yourself in the organization through the sort of your ability to sort of engage in conversations and whatever else other techniques you use to sort of to get the information and knowledge that you want. And of course, I mentioned this earlier on that this is the sort of the participants, and there's a whole the taxonomy of roles. The observer is participant, so you can see here that sort of on the left-hand side we've got overt research, which is the sort of the where we tend to be. People know what we're doing, why we're doing it. We've gone through all the sort of the ethical considerations, as opposed to the other side, where it's covert, where again there may be it may be possible, but it's much more sort of prone to problems, and ethical committees or ethics committees don't like it because, of course, of the sort of the inherent dangers. But of course, in the sort of the top left-hand corner, you've got the, if I put the cursor, where you go in and you sort of you are not literally, but you become like the fly on the wall. You stand there, you observe. But of course, what we also have to recognise, our mere presence is a sort of a change in the organisation, and therefore, of course, people may do things differently if they feel they're being observed. And there's lots of research that shows that sort of people do operate differently if they feel that they're under scrutiny. One which I actually like, certainly for sort of students, is to sort of to be an observer as participant. You go into the organisation and you become one of the workers. But having said that, importantly, it's overt. They know what you're up to. They know that if they talk to you, that you are probably going to be observing them and saying what they do and how they do it, as opposed to a complete observer where it's covert, where you're just one of the people in that organisation. Now, again, whether it's there was the classic study of the sort of the motorcycle gang, and this person, Daniel J. Wolfe, I think he's now, I read it many years ago. And the only way he'd get into this motorcycle gang is through the initiation, but he couldn't tell them he was a researcher. And he had to engage in illegal activities because that was what they did. He was able then to sort of to write it all up. But of course, lo and behold, at the end, he had this this dilemma that if he published, he was under the threat of death. And I won't spoil it by telling you how he managed to sort of to do it. But he was able to write up his research and lived to tell the tale. But there were difficulties. And then there's the complete participant, where So actually, I mixed those up. But actually, that's where Daniel J. Wolfe is. So that's much more difficult. So you're not participating. Sorry, just about to be clear, not participating, but you're in the sort of, you're doing it covertly. Now, why people would allow you to sort of to observe is not the matter, but I suppose you hang along. Whereas, of course, in the sort of the top right-hand corner, to be absolutely sort of clear about this, you're the person sort of doing and being involved, but of course nobody knows you are, apart from hopefully sort of your ethics committees who are watching your back if they've agreed to this. And it's, as I say, something which they're very low to sort of to agree to because of all the sort of the risks that are involved. Interviewing, usually unstructured, exploring concepts and actions, evolves, which of course I think is the sort of, that's the key word, and adapts as the sort of the research progresses. You may use standard questions. I'm a great believer in sort of, particularly if you are interviewing, sort of maybe you have a sort of again, that repertoire, the standard questions you want to ask that you ask everyone, and the open-ended questions, and be able to sort of to get the sort of the response. And of course, this is where recording becomes very important, because of course you can then transcribe what they said and not what they you think they said. And again, I've been to this where examiners have asked students, well, did you record? No. How did you sort of record their answers? Well, I wrote it up later. Well, how do you know that's what they said? Oh, that's how I remembered. And of course, that does give examiners a chance to sort of to really sort of start poking at your armor, and it can become problematic. Focused on events have already been observed, and again, that's a really useful way of surfacing practice and getting people to explain what went on and why. Case studies I really like, because of course that's where you go into an organisation over a protracted period of time, and you may make regular visits, and you can sort of observe events as they sort of progress over a period of time. And of course, it's also about context and developing understanding. Generalization may be possible. Of course, this is the whole point that, again, I hear this, just because you sort of you observed something going on in one case study, does it sort of apply elsewhere? Well, no, of course not, because it's, and this is always the difficulty. Can you generalize from one or a handful of case studies? Well, no, but that is the sort of the nature. And I think if we recognize that's how case studies operate, then we're all better for it. And then finally, I'm going to action research. I'm a great believer in this, because, of course, this is where if you're able to sort of stimulate an idea, and then to sort of effectively it becomes like an experiment in inverted commas, where you sort of you create the sort of the idea, you get people to sort of to engage in implementing it, and for better or for worse, you see whether it works or whether it doesn't work. Obviously, it requires a degree of time, which of course is people are going to have to sort of be dedicated to, and it involves risk. It may not work in the way that it happens. Well, so you hope it will. It may indeed be an absolute disaster. But I'm a great believer that even disasters and failure, there's a lot of learning. But of course, if you've got people who've participated in this on the basis that it's going to be positive, and it doesn't turn out to be as positive as they thought, or indeed more particularly failure, then that's not going to be helpful to them, or particularly to you. And you've got to be absolutely sort of upfront in the sort of the risks that are involved right from the outset. It obviously requires a lot of time and input. Who's going to sort of pay for those resources? Will the organisation willingly commit to that? I think it's often a lot better, a lot more straightforward and easier for people who work in organisations, because of course they know the personalities, and they can champion the idea. But hey, as I say, you've got to sort of be prepared to sort of to be open about the risks, because of course, as I say, not everything happens in the way that you think it may do. And of course, as I've said a couple of moments ago, if things do go wrong, there's lots of learning from it. But hey, don't expect people to thank you for that. But of course, as we know from our experience as humanity, we learn from things that go wrong. We've learned a lot from the pandemic. Will it stop future pandemics? No, but it perhaps make us better able to deal with them if they come along in the future. Okay, I'm coming to the end now. Making decisions. Yeah, this is the sort of as I said, more particularly for people who sort of go into organisations outsiders, getting in, getting on, and getting out. And of course, in that sort of, it's the idea that you've got to gain the access, you've got to be able to do the work, and you've then got to be able to negotiate your sort of your departure. But what do you need to be able to do to adapt, be realistic, be pragmatic and don't try and change the world. Do what you think will work. Compromise if you're sort of required to do so, and if it becomes expedient. I think that is also very important. Learning to sort of to do things, and perhaps and again, this comes back to if your research question or hypothesis is overly sort of elaborate and complicated, you may need to sort of to trim it down, because that's important. This point here, thinking about future relationships, yeah, be careful, because of course you may want to work with these people in the future. So if things do go badly, for whatever reason, sometimes there are events beyond your control, try and as much as possible to mediate and I don't know, to try and gain the positives here, because of course there is always learning if people are willing to to stand back and reflect. And again, I would exhort all of you, think about the things that, or the things that have gone wrong in your life. You know, a journey that went wrong, for instance, and you ended up somewhere that you didn't want to be. It's not pleasant, and it may induce a lot of sort of fear and panic. But of course, if you are willing to sort of to go with the flow, then it may work out to be more interesting. You may learn something useful along the way, although it may not feel like that. And of course, as I've indicated on a number of occasions, it's about then being able to subsequently publish this work, and that's how reputations are made. Okay, I'm going to sort of, this is, if you like, the sort of the bit of advertising, so that there is a sort of advanced course in this, writing up and submitting your thesis, which comes in 3 formats. You say the first, the free self-study with peer support. Second, which is fully tutored, or thirdly, flexible on-demand feedback whenever you need it. And what I would suggest is that you can talk to Andreas or Jack about the sort of the way in which that operates. And of course, there's a sort of link in the sort of the on the slide that you can follow. And of course, this will obviously be on the sort of the DocHub website. So we're going to engage in a group activity. And again, obviously I don't want to take too long, but what I'd like you to think about is one impediment to success in your own research and how you believe it may be overcome. And the objective is that you're going to consider what the issues are, and hopefully what we'll be able to do is by collective engagement, we're going to sort of formulate some logical solutions to the problems that you're having in developing logical solutions. And you know, this is essentially a bit of action research and action learning, more particularly. So it's a safe space. No information will be shared outside the forum. I think that we're going to turn off the sort of the camera or the recording anyway. Be honest, because honesty does help. Honest, and of course that's one of the, sort of the central principles of sort of action research. Because of course, you know, we don't judge others in this safe space. And of course, the most important thing, of course, is this creative thinking, thinking about lateral thinking and radical thinking is often very useful in coming out with sort of useful solutions. Okay, I'm going to right. Shall